Welcome everyone, we're so glad that you're here. The first half hour of today's talk will be a talk. And in the second half hour, we'll have room for questions. You'll have the opportunity to both ask your question out loud or text it to a number on the screen at the end of the talk. Our speaker today is Xandra. She comes from just outside Denver, Colorado, and has a background in the biological sciences. She regularly speaks on topics including paleontology, biology, cosmology, philosophy, philology, anthropology, and Christian apologetics. And to be honest, I don't know what half of those words mean, so she's really smart. Yesterday, she gave a great talk on whether science and faith are enemies. And today, she'll be speaking on where God is in our suffering. It's a great topic that touches all of us in some way. So please join me in welcoming her to the mic.
Tonight, it's only the daytime.
Yes, what an interesting topic. I was excited when they assigned me this topic to speak on, where is God in my suffering? Because it's quite a different facet of the suffering question than I normally address. And we can approach this from many different angles. Why does suffering even happen? Does suffering matter? Does my suffering have purpose or meaning? There are many different angles from which we can view the suffering question. Today we're going to be asking, where is God in my personal suffering? And as you mentioned so rightly, this affects all of us. Everyone in this room has suffered, because suffering is part of the human experience, isn't it? We may suffer in different ways, we may have different perspectives, but we have all experienced suffering on some level. I'm not an expert in the philosophy of suffering, but I am an experienced sufferer. I have had many interesting experiences through my short life thus far. I've been attacked by a horde of jellyfish as I swam off the coast of Zanzibar alone. Oh, yeah. That hurt. I've been nearly chased off of a cliff by an angry bull elephant whose territory I was unknowingly invading. I've been attacked by Sifu in the middle of the night as I slept in my tent. I survived the 7.8 magnitude Kaikoura earthquake in New Zealand and the aftermath of aftershocks as well. At the age of 20, I wrote a goodbye entry in my journal as I laid on what I thought was my deathbed in Dar es Salaam, so that when they found that document, they'd be able to tell my family what had happened to me. I've suffered delirium of dengue fever deep in a Honduran jungle, and I've almost lost this leg to jungle rot, which I contracted in the Ngorongoro crater. People tell me that I should really stop traveling, but I can't help myself. I've been bit by the travel bug, perhaps you have too. These are only examples of physical suffering. There's also emotional suffering as well. That's a whole nother animal where the heart seems pushed beyond its breaking point. That phone call saying they figured out why mom is sick. It's cancer, and it's a bad one. Or when your fiance sits you down for a talk and says, I found someone else, and I think she's the one, not you. I could go on, and so could you. We've all had these deep, profound experiences. And what really kills me sometimes are the responses of well-meaning people who said to me things like, oh, there's a hidden purpose in this, right? Oh, this is gonna make you stronger. This happened for a reason. Or, I know that he's gone, I know that he's dead, but he's in a better place. And a lot of these responses are well-meaning, from well-meaning people, but sometimes they seem to cut me to the quick, because they don't really answer the question my heart is asking. And in these moments, my soul really cries out, God, where are you? Are you there? Do you see what's happening to me? Where are you in this? Perhaps you've asked a similar question. How we answer that question dictates how we view God, how we view ourselves, and how we view the world. I have had the good fortune of spending years at a time in other countries around the world. I've spent extended time in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. And I've also lived in Oceania for a couple of years. I've been struck in my time in these different areas by the stark differences in how people view the suffering question of where is God in my suffering. And I'm really grateful for the chance to be able to travel and experience these different cultures and different ways of looking at the world. I've met people who see things completely differently than I do. And if I was going to guess, I'd guess that there are many people in this room who see suffering in very different ways as well. So I just want to kind of invite you to join me on my journey as I can reconstruct the thought process that I went down as I was investigating this question experientially through different ideologies that I've lived with and learned from. So a very prominent religion is Hinduism. And I spent a long time in the south of India where I was working with young girls who had been rescued from sexual slavery. And I was part of a program that was trying to integrate them back into society after spending years in these prison brothels, basically, from a very young age. Many of them were taken in their young childhood. One girl's story will haunt me forever. I won't share her name or her picture with you, even though you'll probably never meet her, just to be respectful. But when she was a very young child, she was raped by her uncle. And after this happened, her own family threw her out of their village, cast her out, because they believed that this bad thing had happened to her because she had bad karma. They believed she had done something bad in a previous life. And because of that, she was experiencing suffering now. And when I asked her if her uncle had ever been apprehended or punished, her answer was no. He's never been punished for this. So in Hinduism, suffering oftentimes is just your fault. It's basically your fault for something that you've done, perhaps in a previous life. Experiencing current suffering satisfies the debt incurred for past negative behavior. It's a very prominent idea in this ideology. Rabindranath Tagore, who's an Indian Hindu mystic, said this: "Let me not beg for the stilling of my pain, but for the heart to conquer it." So it's this idea that you cannot escape from suffering. Suffering is inevitable. Our goal through our suffering is to grit our teeth and bear it and get through it and try to do better in this life so we won't experience as much suffering in the next life. And we can ask, where is God in this suffering? Or where are the gods? Or why is this happening to me? And the answer might be, well, they're standing over you and punishing you for your past wrongdoings. Or this is just a natural outcurring of decisions you've made in a past life. And for some people, this is a very satisfactory answer, cause and effect. What goes around comes around. And so on one level, it does kind of make sense, but as I was processing through this mentally, I found it dissatisfactory, deeply dissatisfactory. If you were driving down the road and you saw someone whose car had broken down and it was in the middle of a snowstorm like today, would you pull over and ask if they needed help? Or would you keep driving because you feared that they had bad karma and they didn't want that bad karma to rub off on you? You see, many people avoid reaching out in brotherhood to their fellow human creatures because of, quote, bad karma. So part of me was left disturbed by this ideology. Buddhism, another very prominent religion, has said that suffering is really an illusion. It's not actually real. And in fact, the chairs that you're sitting on aren't real. My perception of God is not real. This stuff, this matter that we're made of is illusory. It's not actually true. Peter Morrell, who's a Buddhist commentator, says that Buddhism strives to maximize a thorough understanding of emptiness. Why this emphasis on emptiness? Well, let's go to a religious text. The Tsongkhapa says this: "We must strive to be unattached to the pleasures of mundane existence. In being born, we've entered into an iron cage of apprehending self. Our suffering is only removed through the realization of emptiness. So the goal when we approach suffering is to detach ourselves from our own desires, our own emotions, right? If my brother passes away, if I am unattached from that desire of him and that love for him, then I will not suffer when he dies. And I'm free to just let him go because I've detached myself from my desires. At that moment, we enter a prison because our emotions and our desires define us as human beings. They're not something we should fear. They're not something that we should deny ourselves. So again, I find this answer in part, though it may work pragmatically, dissatisfactory when I reflect on my own suffering. Then, of course, we have atheism. Many of my friends are atheists, as you can imagine, since I'm a biologist. And in this viewpoint, suffering is a biological and a physiological phenomenon of discomfort due to a predisposed understanding of normalcy, right? We have this idea of what's normal, and when you move out of that, that causes discomfort. So to quote one of the most prominent atheistic author, who's called Richard Dawkins, this is from his book, A River Out of Eden. The total amount of suffering per year is beyond all decent contemplation. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky. And you won't find any rhyme or any reason in any of this. Sorry, I'm belching. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. How does that one fit? Suffering. Pitiless indifference. But he's right, isn't it? Because in this viewpoint, suffering is real. Suffering is real, but it has no meaning, it has no purpose. This life is just the outworking of a natural phenomenon. God is not real, but your suffering is, and you are utterly alone in that suffering. Is that satisfactory? I don't know. I still wrestle through that. I don't think I'm satisfied by that because I feel that my suffering does matter. Then we move on to some other ideologies, such as Islam. Islam says that God is real, God is powerful, and he's testing you to see how strong you are when you suffer, and that's part of the faith process. I've read the Quran, perhaps you have too. This is one passage that I think sums up this idea really well. It's from the surah. It says, God will surely test you with a measure of fear and hunger and a loss of wealth, lives and fruits, and give good news to the patient. Those who, when an affliction visits them, would say, indeed, we belong to Allah, and to him do we indeed return. It is they that receive the blessings of their Lord and his mercy, and it is they who are the rightly guided. So it's an idea that suffering is real, and suffering is a test of character. How much can you carry? What is your true character? If you truly believe in God and you suffer very deeply, then you won't turn away from him no matter how much suffering comes through your door. And on one sense, this makes sense, right? Because we know that, God bless you, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger, as they say, right? And we do know that people who have suffered deeply, they do seem to have this strength of character in one sense. But one thing that bothers me about this view is that if God is really all-knowing, if he knows everything, then why does he have to test you to see whether or not you belong to him, truly? Couldn't he just look inside of your heart and see whether or not you do or don't believe in him? It doesn't seem like the test itself makes sense to me just on a philosophical level. And again, I don't want you to just take my word on any of this. I encourage you to go to the religious texts, to read these authors, and to wrestle through how do we answer this question of where God is in my suffering? Another very prominent religion is Christianity. And investigating Christianity has really affected my view of suffering, because Christianity portrays a God who suffers, a God who actually suffers. What kind of God would be weak enough to suffer? So on the outside, it's a confusing idea, right? A God who would suffer with us or for us. But I think a good analogy is when, not too long ago, I was out with a friend of mine, and she has a little girl who's, I don't know, probably less than 2. She's just learning to walk. And you know, when toddlers are learning to walk, they're like super teetery, but they run really fast and you can't catch them in time, so they're always just falling over and like just biffing it into walls and tables and everything. Yeah, it's awful to watch because you can't do anything. But we were at the zoo, and this little girl, sure enough, she makes a beeline for this super steep hill and starts running down this hill along a concrete sidewalk, and then she just plows it right onto her face. Oh, it was awful. And of course she burst into tears, and her mom, my friend, went running down the hill, picked her up, and I kind of, went down just to see if everything was okay. And when I got to the scene, I was really moved, because the mom was actually crying harder than her daughter was. She was so upset to see her little girl get hurt. And she said to me, "I think that fall hurt me more than it hurt my daughter." That's the picture of God in the Christian Bible. And a lot of people who haven't read the Bible don't know this. Our suffering hurts his heart more than our own hearts. It's this idea that he's like a parent or like a friend who comforts us through our suffering, wants to be there with us. He doesn't want to abandon us or leave us alone when we're in pain. The Bible describes a God who collects all of our tears in a bottle because our suffering is precious to him. Isn't that a cool idea? He collects every tear you cry in a little bottle. And every wrong is made right at the end of this world. It says he will wipe the tears from every face. It's this image of comfort, and it's an image of compassion, as opposed to an angry God who delights in inflicting the helpless. The Christian God does not will that any of us should perish. He's not a faraway God who doesn't see our suffering, but he's near to the brokenhearted. And he's not just nearby wiping our tears away, but he's described as someone who goes through pain and suffering alongside us and bears that with us in a restoration process. Biblical commentator James Atkinson writes this: God is not there in spite of defeat, sorrow, pain, suffering, and death. Not at all. He taught that God himself confronts us in person and makes his presence near, in, and through defeat, sorrow, pain, and suffering. So he walks with us through our suffering so that we won't be overwhelmed. But the stark contrast here gets even starker, because not only does God suffer with us, he also suffered for us. Jesus himself, the Bible writes, was a man acquainted with sorrow and full of grief. People did not understand him at all. People tried to kill him many times, and when they were successful, even as he was being murdered, he looked upon them with love, and he said, "I forgive you." Even in his darkest hour, he responded with tremendous love, tremendous compassion. And because he suffered, he can be with us in our suffering. This didn't completely make sense to me until I reflected upon some events of my childhood. One thing in particular, my father has a genetic disease. And because of this, when my brother and I were small children, we often had to go to the hospital to be tested to see whether or not we had contracted this disease, because people usually get it in childhood. And I hated going to the hospital. And I remember sitting in the car on the way, shaking like a leaf in the back seat and begging my mom, please don't take us to the hospital. I really don't want to get my blood drawn. But we had to go every single month to be tested for this disease because it's a very fast-moving disease. My brother, who was older than me, always offered to go first so that I wouldn't be afraid. And I would sit in the chair and watch him very carefully as he willingly sat himself down in that chair and put his arm out and let the nurse come and poke him with the needle and take his blood out. And afterwards, she would put a Band-Aid on him, and he would come to me and he would show me the Band-Aid and say, you can do it. Don't be afraid. You can do it. And because of his strength and his courage, I was able to have strength and courage in my own suffering. In the same way, Christ is described as our older brother in the Bible, who went before us into suffering, who spread himself out and allowed himself to be pierced for our sins, for our transgressions. And in the same way, he came away unharmed, just like that Band-Aid, with just a couple holes in his hands, but alive. He conquered death so that we wouldn't have to fear death anymore. Because of this, the Bible says, death, where is your sting? Grave, where is your victory? We don't have to be afraid of suffering anymore because there's someone who's gone before us and someone who'll be there with us in the moment, the person of Jesus Christ. Perhaps you're seeing the theme in the Christian view now, which is love, intense self-sacrificial love. That God loved the people on this planet so much that he offered himself up to suffer, so that anyone who would believe in him and follow him would ultimately be released from their own suffering and be free from the prisons of this life, so they could reach out and take his hand and walk to a place where there'd be no more crying, no more sorrow, and no more suffering. I don't have all the answers, and I still have a lot to learn, but if there's one thing I do know, it's that contrast is the mother of clarity. Contrast is the mother of clarity. And when I compare this way of viewing suffering with some of the other ideologies out there, I find this makes way more sense of my suffering. I don't want to go through my suffering alone, and I don't want my suffering to not matter. I don't want my suffering to be minimized by saying it's not even real, or that it's my fault. Everything is always my fault, and I'm being punished constantly, or tested constantly. No other ideology I've investigated depicts a God who suffers with his people and for his people. And he allows us to ask why. And he allows us to be angry or confused. That's okay. You know, last night, I was leaving the Science Theaters building, and I was coming out, and I just noticed there this concrete structure with like a wheel on it or something. You know what I'm talking about? And on it, it's written, Moshwi Togam Swas. Moshwi Togam Swas. I was thinking, what is Moshwi Togam Swas doing on a campus in Canada? I haven't met any Irish, like native Irish people here. So I went to my hotel room and I looked it up, and it's your motto. It's your motto. Do you know what it means?
Yes.
What does it mean? I lift my eyes up. It's from a psalm that was written by a man who was deep in suffering, deep in turmoil. And despite his suffering and his turmoil, he penned the words, I lift my eyes up. Where does my help come from? My help comes from God, the maker of heaven and earth. He won't abandon me. He'll be with me in my suffering. It's a beautiful motto, a really, truly beautiful motto. And I think we should be true to that in times of trouble, to lift our eyes up. Now, I don't know what you're going through, but I do know someone who wants to go through it with you. Jesus. He's reaching his hand out towards you, and all you have to do is take that hand. I've never regretted my decision to do that, and I don't think that you would either. When we talk about deep issues like suffering, it can stir up a lot of emotion, anger, confusion, whatever. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to have a moment of quiet, and I'm going to say a simple prayer, okay? So I want everyone to just close your eyes, bow your heads, take a couple deep breaths, and just relax. If you're out there and you feel like this is you today, you feel like Jesus is reaching his hand out to you, and you want to make that decision to reach up and take his hand, I'm going to pray this simple prayer, and I invite you to echo that in your own heart. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to say anything. This is a personal moment for you, between you and God. Okay, no one else needs to know about this. Let's pray. Jesus, I'm sorry for the things that I've done in my past. I'm sorry that I'm a person that I don't want to be. I'm sorry for the times when I turned away from you. Please take my hand now and help me through my suffering. Help me through my daily life. Thank you that you went before me as my older brother. Thank you that you suffered for me so that I could be free. I ask you to come into my heart now, and I hand my life over to you so that I can walk on your path. Amen.
Well, we're running out of time here, so I just wanted to say one more thing before I hand it back to our host, and that is, if you made that decision while Xandra was praying and you decided to accept this way, this path out of suffering, and accept the person of Jesus, please just tell us. We would love to just celebrate with you and give you some resources to get you started on your journey. But other than that, let's thank Xandra for her talk.